Hello and welcome, bonjour, to this digital conference today on youth employability in a changing world. How do HEIs, higher education institutions, adapt to the future of work? My name is Alex. I'm delighted to be your host for today. This Franco-British digital conference for HEI institutions, students, local authorities and companies has been jointly organised by HESAM Université, the British Council, and the University of London Institute here in Paris. The digital revolution raises, as I'm sure you realise, many questions about the future of jobs and its consequences for the career paths of the learning community. It's estimated that 65% of children entering primary school today will be doing jobs that do not yet exist. VUCA, which is an acronym which I'm sure you know, but refers to our volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world, highlights the urgent need for higher education institutions and their ecosystems to adapt, not least of all, to a world dominated these days by COVID. So we will be asking and hopefully answering a lot of your questions about this today. We will have two presentations generally later on, but first of all, I'd like to hand over to our three organisers, Bob Lewis, Michel, TERRÉ and Tim GORE. We will start with the France director of the British Council, Bob Lewis. Over to you. Bonjour.
Bonjour, Alex. Thank you very much for your introduction. We are living in a higher education world which is fragmented and challenged by radical change at the moment. And it's impacting students and teachers and researchers. The online lessons have changed the way we think and work. The travel restrictions have impacted us enormously. And at university level, there are financial constraints that there weren't years ago. And I think it's very important at this moment that we should be looking at youth employability. These EU policy dialogues are a core action for British Council's cultural engagement here in France and a contribution to the European dialogue on forward-looking topics for higher education. Over the course of the last 18 months to 2 years, we have held similar policy dialogues on SDGs and how universities are engaging towards SDGs, looking at new curricula, actions to ensure sustainability on campuses, for example. We've looked at impact of digital transformation on teaching and learning, and the increasing role of universities towards community engagement and their impact on society. And lastly, we've also been exploring the future of internationalism in a post-COVID-19 world. So these are all examples of the types of things. And I want to thank Catherine Siracco, the head of education at British Council, for her leadership in this work. And I believe this is part of a very important role the British Council can play across Europe to help dialogue and collaboration, exchange and partnership between universities, higher education, research centres as well across Europe. The topics of the policy dialogues are aligned with our key French stakeholders' governance strategies. PSL has brought SDGs to the core of its governance plan. HESAM University's 2030 strategy, building up future careers, is underlying the topic we are addressing this year on youth employability in a changing world and how HEIs adapt to the future of work. Enhancing student employability outcomes is, of course, on the top of agenda for British universities as well. And the digital transformation, particularly in AI and the use of robots, has brought significant changes on work and new jobs, which ultimately urge universities to reframe teaching and learning to meet the challenges of a skills-based work environment and prepare future-ready students. I've been 40 years in business now, and I have to say that we are constantly in change, but the pace of change and the impact of change today is never greater than it's been before. And I really want to thank all those people who are contributing today, because this is a vital discussion that we're having. Alex, back over to you, and I hope the course of today's conference is greatly appreciated by everyone.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Bob, for that introduction. Let's hand over now to Michel TERRÉ, the president of HESAM University. Bonjour.
Bonjour. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Mr. Lewis, for this initiative and inviting HESAM University to prepare this conference with the British Council on this very important topical issues. With our 14 members in HESAM, we are a unique place with more than 110,000 students, more than 650 PhD students, 2 graduate schools, 40 research units, and so on. But what I can say is that all research and educational programs in HESAM, and it's with our members, we have the dual ambition of academic and professional excellence. And this ambition today is expressed in innovative project-based pedagogy that is in close collaboration with the territories and the socio-professional world. And one of the reasons why we thought important to address these issues with you today is our commitment to help local industry and communities to address this fast-changing world. And I can say that all our members here in Paris or in France, our engineering school, our schools of applied arts, design, architecture, in every campus, support the development of new education curricula and pedagogies. And at HESAM, we are committed to monitoring this future of work. And we have this program named HESAM 2030 that creates and deploys throughout France new degrees offered to all and with a priority given to vocational baccalaureate holders. And it's adaptable to everyone, everywhere, and throughout life with new pedagogical methods. And we will give you some example of our activities today and our examples of our programs. But we really try to build new programs and to become change makers, if I could say. So we are very glad to launch this conference with our partners, University of London in Paris, of course. And I can say that the University of London and HESAM University are both working as federations of several higher education organizations on the channel, and we are very close together. And we have this, in 2019, we signed with University of London in Paris a partnership, and we're very proud of it and very happy to be here today with you. What I can say is that we really hope that this policy dialogue will help everyone to build new programs and to collaborate together. Okay, thank you once more, Mr. Lewis. Thank you, Alex.
Merci beaucoup, Michel. Thank you very much indeed for those words of introduction. And for our final introduction, welcome words, let's hand over to Tim Gore, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the University of London Institute in Paris. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Michel. Thank you, Bob. We're really, really proud to be working with Michel and Bob and the British Council and HESAM University here in Paris on a collaboration that we think is really, really important. The University of London Institute in Paris has been here since the 19th century. It's been a central part of Anglo-French higher education relationships since that time. And we run what we think is quite a unique academic and intellectual community here in Paris, which is very much about connecting, first of all, the twin cities, London and Paris, but also both our countries, and for the University of London being a bridgeway into Europe. Employability has always been a really important part of what we do. We run a full university program here in Paris. We have a very interdisciplinary undergraduate program, as well as postgraduate programs that we run ourselves as the University of London, but also with our sister institutions, particularly Queen Mary University of London, with King's College London, and with Goldsmiths University as well. And as Michel said, we have a strategic partnership with HESAM University here in Paris and work very, very closely. In fact, are co-located with the British Council as well. Employability is part of the University of London a strategy that stretches from 2020 to 2025. One of my colleagues later on, Dr. Kate Gilbany, will undoubtedly tell you about the Centre for Excellence in Careers and Employability that we're working on. We've always taken a transnational and comparative point of view here in Paris, and we think that it enriches our academic enterprise and our ways of seeing the world and understanding the world. And I think this Franco-British conference will certainly bring some really interesting perspectives to a world that we know is changing very, very rapidly. But we're also aware, and I'm very aware from our own students, that our students are up for the challenge and are up for a world that is evolving and moving forward in interesting and sometimes unpredictable ways. I hope you enjoy the conference. Thank you very much. Back to you, Alex.
Thank you very much indeed for those introductory words from all three of you, and thank you for organising this interesting virtual conference today. We now have two presentations, Foresight on Work 2050, Insights on Long-Term Scenarios by the Millennium Project. We're delighted to have Cornelia DAHEIM, who's the founder and director of Future Impacts Consulting. Hello, Cornelia. Just a word of introduction. The Millennium Project is a non-profit think tank on future issues working via over 60 nodes throughout the world. And you have conducted a project spanning several years, resulting, among other outputs, in scenarios mapping possible changes right up until 2050. So one of these scenarios paints a picture of a potential new understanding by all of us of what work actually means. So Cornelia, asking you with your crystal ball, we're all ears. Can you give us your presentation, please?
Thank you, Alex. And first of all, before I go to my crystal ball, as far as that's possible, I would like to take a moment to also thank the organizers very much for setting this up. I think the topic we are talking today, if we dare to really go towards rapid and bold solutions in this field, could be a field where we really have one of the key levers to tackle not only the issue of youth employability, but also with the changes we make for higher education institutions to already contribute to dealing with the global challenges that are obvious, especially I think in this year and what we've seen over the last 12 months. So I would like to echo what Bob stressed at the beginning, that in this time of rapid change, we are seeing also more and more the interconnectedness of challenges. So I think higher education institutions and with the change they can bring forward have a key role to also help us tackle these global challenges from a socio-ecological transformation, dealing with sustainability, the challenges of climate change and all those interconnected factors. So I think it's really critical. And now let me look forward and look into that perspective of 2050 really, to give you some inspiration for what we can discuss today and go deeper into later on. So Alex, you've lined out, thank you, already a bit about this study, which I think is in a way also really exceptional in that it looks at the long term. It really set out to look at 2050 on purpose. Why did we do that? We saw in the Millennium Project, which, as you said, is a non-profit organization spanning nodes around the world, over 60 of them, who bring together policymakers, education institutions, and industry. We saw that this topic of the future of work is gaining more and more traction. It's becoming more and more important, and we are seeing rapid change also simply in the labor markets themselves, but are also seeing the interconnectedness to other challenges. And we did a quick research on the studies that were out there, and we saw that most of them only went ahead to try to look at maybe 10 years ahead, 20. And yes, it becomes more difficult to try to anticipate what could be possible over the long term. But at the same time, nearly all those studies stress that we will probably, within the systems we have, be able to deal with the change that we are seeing over the maybe next decade or so, but that after 2030 approximately, the challenges might exacerbate. And that's because of a synergy of technologies, to say it simply. So they hinted at a massive change that might come from the period of 2030 and 2050, and what is called general artificial intelligence, so sort of self-learning artificial intelligence, does play a key role in that assumption. That afterwards, there might really be a fundamental change to how work works, what kind of work is there. So that's why we said, okay, we try to anticipate what could happen until 2050, not with a crystal ball, but we're trying to look at alternative scenarios, try to make potential alternatives transparent, and try to anticipate what could come. I'm stressing the alternatives because that's sort of the serious foresight approach, to say there are always alternative futures and we can shape those. And that's why we set about really looking at this long-term future. Before I go into speaking more about what these perspectives are for 2050, I would like to take just a moment to also look back and maybe make us aware of the changes we have seen recently already in labor markets and in how work is organized. And interesting enough, when you look at the data, these are changes that are visible globally. Although, of course, there are differences in the labor market, but still some changes are really visible globally. And among them, to name just a couple of the most critical maybe, is a globalization of the labor markets, especially for knowledge-based work, especially for the younger generations, where we see more of a generation of job nomads who really work internationally. We see how this is connected also to wealth generation, and we see a big change towards an increased flexibilization of work. And this refers to work forms, so whether you are employed or self-employed, or maybe both at the same time, doing also a bit of freelance work. We also see new forms emerging, such as platform work, which has really challenged also how we deal with for example, regulating work and making sure workers have good rights and good working conditions. So this just is an example that we have seen already, and this is not looking forward, but just looking at the changes we have seen already in the data, that we are already seeing, you could say, a reorganization of how work works. And to give us a bit more background, yes, the project was a long and deep research approach. It worked across the globe, spanning from 2014 to 2019, started with a big literature review, and then at its core, it had what is a critical foresight methodology, a real-time Delphi study. And this brought together really academics, policymakers, experts in industry, also business, thinking about what could be these long-term perspectives, and in many respects, which I will line out in a bit more detail now, debating what are sort of critical turning points that we must look at to shape the future in what you could say a more desired direction. It also used workshops across the world, some of them also taking place to bring together, for example, participants across Europe, where we had a strong participation from France and the UK, to discuss what are the implications and what do we need to do there. And I can report that especially the higher education institutions took up these studies quite strongly, bringing it into their strategy development. So I will show you a bit now what these scenarios really are. And we have three, and I will not line out all three of them to keep it a bit simpler, but would like to first of all look at what we found, what could be possible until 2050, if we take, some would say a more realistic, others would say a more pessimistic approach, which is more oriented about us not really tackling the challenges that we see. What's interesting is that across all three scenarios, we have the assumption, and this was really quite a consensus among the experts, that this tendency of the demand in the work and labor market for new jobs. Alex mentioned in his introduction that a strong part of future jobs do not exist yet, as we have seen in past times. For example, if you said 20 years ago that somebody would become a social media manager, many people wouldn't have understood. So this is an assumption here across all scenarios, that this will change massively, and there will be a share of, you could say, maybe around 30% or more jobs, depending on the scenario, which emerge and for which we don't have a skills description, a job description yet. And they emerge around the new technologies and how they go into synergy. These new technologies that change the labor market range from AI to digitalization to synthetic biology, and there would be many more to name, but they really change the picture across the scenarios. And they also lead to, this has to be said, unfortunately, to a loss of many jobs which were previously done by humans and are now more automated, are changed around. There's of course also new jobs emerging, so I know this is always a debate to what can be recompensated. But it has to be said, in the, for example, the more negative scenario, it's called political and economic turmoil. This change that we are seeing and that the experts said is to be expected under nearly all realistic assumptions if we're really seeing a great progress in artificial intelligence, which we have underestimated over the last decade, you have to say. If we see that, then this will happen to the labor market, and there will be a fundamental change in what kind of skills are demanded and which kind of jobs are accessible to people. And in this negative scenario, we are not dealing well with it. To cut it short, this means that we are seeing a rapid rise of unemployment, more social conflicts, more conflicts around access to wealth, to making ends meet. We are seeing also more geopolitical conflicts around this and social polarization. So of course, it's always easy, I am aware, to paint a very bleak picture, but sometimes it can also help to look at it to see what we would like to avoid. In this scenario, we are also not dealing well with all the other challenges around there, just to name the top one, climate change. We are not managing to redistribute our efforts towards this. And it's a world in which, of course, some do well, but many do not well, to much worse. On the other hand, and this is what I would like to stress, is what we managed, and this was really a key aim of the project, and it was not easy to achieve that, to also arrive at what you could say is a positive scenario. And this scenario is called, if humans were free, the self-actualization economy. And it's a scenario in which really the concept of work is reinvented. Some of the assumptions of this scenario, which were debated a lot on the experts strongly over the years, are the same actually as in the other two, and also the very negative scenario, which is that there will be a fundamental shift in change in the skills demand and the jobs that exist. But what happens in this scenario is that we understand these challenges early, anticipate them, and create rapid and quite agile solutions to them across the institutions. And among them, the higher education institutions, actually, you could say, taking a lead. So it's clear in this scenario that the old system also of social security will not work when we are seeing this fundamental shift, and this mainly also more strongly affects those which have what you could call a more difficult access to continuing education. And this is changed in this scenario. So there's a global, actually, education push which cuts across nations, larger world regions, and really also has a reinvestment in this agenda. People also start to put lots of their efforts in this scenario towards contributing on what you would today call pro bono work or community-oriented work, to help with dealing with, for example, climate change in their local communities, and getting their skills up to really making an impact there. But also what we are seeing in this scenario is a bit of the reorientation towards how you can have a good income a good quality of life, you could say, when you maybe have to also in your lifetime switch your jobs much, much more often than you would have expected maybe when you started out 20 years ago. And I'll say a bit more about these assumptions in the next couple of slides. So you can say that across the scenarios, but especially also in the positive scenario, where we managed to paint a picture of how we can deal well with these challenges that we see upcoming. It's the end of business as usual around the assumptions about what work is and how we organize it. There's a massive shift in how we organize work and also self-employment. That's the big rise that you see on the left-hand side of the chart I've brought, which maps out the organization of how our work is mapped out formally, you could say. So this means that in this positive scenario, we really have a new understanding of work, which is maybe less around just creating an income, having to do that to create that, which it is for many. And maybe also less around status. So it is more about embracing and enabling people to do that. That's critical for the employability question at the stake here today. Enabling people to find the ways how they can contribute to society, contribute to the means that are critical to them, and how they can make a difference and find meaning. So work in this understanding is less of a means to an end, you could say, but more a means to contribute to society. And people do that in a different way than we have seen in the last decades, where we still had this idea of the normal employment being the norm. And I'd just like to stress that in this scenario, yes, we do have assumptions around reorganizing social security. And one of the surprising insights maybe here was that in the experts we talked to, there was quite a strong vote at the end after lots of debate that we will have to find new schemes of how to make sure that if people have, for example, to change jobs a lot, if they have to adapt because the previous work does not continue and they have to change, that they have a good income and can rely on being able to adapt and find, for example, new education again and again, and then go to a new job. That they have a good income and life conditions. And 80%, if you sum it up across the more tentative answers of the experts and the more strong who are clear about this, say that maybe solutions like basic income, which of course is not easy to implement, could be a solution to ensure that this is possible for people to deal with it. And this brings me to a close. There would be much more to say, of course, but maybe just to stress that in these scenarios, in all of them, the more positive long-term ones as well as the more problematic, you could say, or the more mixed bag ones that we have developed, we are seeing a fundamental shift around how work is organized, how it's worked, set up across all areas of what you could say are characteristics of work. This refers to legal forms where we previously had a sort of fixation of a fixed contract employment, you could say, where there's the clear role of the employer and the employed, where we expect that in the future there will be more forms of self-employment, freelance forms, and that's critical to understand more mixed forms also. There may be people do both things at the same time as doing a lot of quite what you would today call pro bono or community-oriented work. Changing work is much more normal under these assumptions, and the work biographies therefore change massively. We don't have this idea, and it will not work for the long term under what we found out, to say you can front load your education at the beginning of your life and then do this job that you have trained for at the beginning of your life. So it will really be a paradigm shift also in education towards more forms of lifelong learning. And it will also affect about how we are organizing ourselves. That's quite critical to understand in how we work. So the place and forms of work will be much more multifaceted. We will change whom we work with, have to be able to work across institutions with people who maybe come from a different cultural context. mobile offices, all this remote work that we have all learned about in the last year, and that we have seen to work also quite well with, of course, a price to pay and things to learn over the last year. This is expected to become much, much more normal, and also a requirement to be able to organize yourself and others and your cooperation with them in these forms of work. So training periods also under these assumptions would be dispersed throughout your lifetime. And this means, and this is maybe also attempting a bit of a handover, that of course the skills demand to have a good sort of self-actualization perspective and employability, especially for youth entering the work market and entering work for the first time maybe, is oriented much less than previously around being trained for a specific job, and depends much more on what we call in the study so-called meta skills, which are also a consensus, you can say, in all the assumption of most studies around the future of work. These are critical thinking, problem solving. The social skills are stressed around cooperation and self-organization, and they really cut across the orientation of being trained for one job at the beginning of your life. But they stress that you can be adaptable, that you keep learning, and this of course has massive repercussions for how we organize also higher education for the existing institutions with new forms like peer-to-peer learning. And this makes me stop at this point, though of course with much, much more to say, but I think we have time now to go deeper into many aspects I might have alluded to and hope to give to you to think about the long term today.
Thank you very much indeed, Cornelia. Thank you for having timed. It's very rare somebody times their intervention exactly to the 20 minutes. That was perfect. Very interesting look into a very exciting but uncertain future for the work world. Learning, as you've just said, in VUCA environments, which you've just joined us, is short for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is a catch-all phrase for, hey, it's crazy out there. Given that students today live in this VUCA world, what are the required capabilities for learners today, and how should HEIs rise to meet this challenge? What would this mean for teaching approaches? We're delighted to have us talk about the challenges for HEIs to prepare future-ready students. With us, Rose Lukin, who is Professor of Learner-Centered Design at UCL Knowledge Lab, UCL Institute of Education, and Director Educate London. Rose, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. And it's really lovely following on from Cornelia, because she's really highlighted some of the issues that I'm going to try and help you address, which is this enormous volatility. And I find throughout the different roles, as you can see listed there on the slide, that volatility comes at us in all of the activities that we are involved in. And we certainly need to ensure that we do prepare young people to be able to cope in this very uncertain world. But I think it's interesting just to reflect a minute on these words: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and to think exactly how uncertain things are at the moment. You know, we look at the global jet stream, for example, and we can see the geopolitics around the US and China and different parts of the world. How's Europe interacting? From a UK perspective, Brexit certainly isn't done, and that has implications on HEIs, levelling up, the upskilling agenda in India, and of course the economic pivot to Asia. But actually, I think we also need to recognise that whilst all these things existed way before COVID, actually COVID, we haven't seen anything yet, because following COVID, there's potentially a recession and then a huge wave of concern around climate change, and then lots of concerns about biodiversity collapse. So we are really in a very, very volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. And so it's time to think about how do we prepare young people to really be ready to face this very uncertain future. And yes, Cornelia has done a great job at setting this up. You know, we are in a further industrial revolution, and certainly AI is playing a key role in this revolution, from automation in the workplace to automation in our homes to automation of the way that we interact in the world. And whilst it's increasingly recognized that many, many jobs in the world will not be fully automated, most jobs will be impacted by AI in some way. But also, as Cornelia outlined very nicely, we can outline scenarios and we can think about skills, but we can't predict the future. And I think we need to recognize that very carefully. And so I'm going to focus on intelligence today, because I think intelligence is very much at the key of how we prepare young people. And it's really a call to redefine the way that we think about human intelligence, precipitated by artificial intelligence and the amazing developments that have happened in AI over the past few decades in particular. And to think about how reconceptualizing our understanding about human intelligence can help us to understand what we need to prepare our young people to be able to do, and therefore how we need to prepare them. But just for a moment, let's think about how all of us are using AI, often without even explicitly realizing, whether we're using smart devices in our home, perhaps to track our heat consumption or to turn the lights on and off, to voice-activated interfaces like Siri or Alexa, or Google Home, whatever your flavor is. Shopping online involves AI. Speech to text, I know I use the voice memo on my phone frequently, and I love to do audio messages to myself as reminders. That's all speech to text. Although I suppose voice memo is an audio recording that then, of course, you can turn into text, which is where the AI gets involved. And if you're like me, I love my Garmin device. I use it to track my running, my exercise. Many of these devices also involve some AI in the analysis of data across millions of people, so that you know whether you're average for your age or whatever it is that you particularly like to track. And if we're traveling, when we are allowed to travel again, that is, often we use navigation apps or software that will help us find the best route from wherever we are to the place that we want to get to. And again, these often use artificial intelligence. So it really is all around us. And certainly within higher education, we're seeing a lot more use of these technologies. And that's helpful, because that helps us to understand a lot more about how these technologies work. So this is just an example from the University of Southern California. And I pick it because it's quite a complex system, and I think it highlights some of the ways in which AI works and can be used. And so this is something called SimSensei. It's an online avatar-based counselling service. So you can see the lady sitting in the pink chair there, who's the avatar counsellor for the student. And you can see that in the multi-sense headed side of the screen, the student's face. And you can see that the software is tracking the way the student's face is revealing emotions. It's also tracking not just what the student is saying in terms of content, but how they're talking, pauses, tone, to try and understand if the student's anxious, for example, or other emotional states that the student may be in as they're interacting with the SimSensei counsellor. And this all is fed back to the SimSensei software to lead to, hopefully, a better experience for the student, because the SimSensei counsellor is adapting to that particular student in the moment. And this is a classic way of using AI, in this adaptive way to meet the needs of a particular student. But really, the reason behind a huge increase in the use of artificial intelligence across the world is because of this perfect storm. And the storm is the three categories of thing that happened at once. So masses of data becoming available, very sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithms that use machine learning techniques to process that data and learn from that data, and masses of computing power and memory that provides the infrastructure to enable the AI to process that data. Far more power and memory than I could have dreamt of when I was a student studying artificial intelligence, when if you wanted to run any program of any size, you had to do it overnight. To have more power in my phone than we had at our fingertips all those years ago. And thinking about what Cornelia was saying about the interconnectedness of the world, about the different scenarios that we can think about as we try and plan, about those meta skills that we know people need to have, and about the end of business as usual. I like to think about this current situation, this VUCA situation, as being a little bit like driving a car along a very foggy road that I've never driven along before. And I find that a helpful analogy. And in a way, if we keep trying to predict what this situation is going to be like, what we're really trying to create is a map. But actually, a map's not really that useful in this situation, because if it's very foggy and I don't really know where I'm going, yes, a map can give me some information. But actually, what's much more important for me is to know that I have a reliable car that has good lights and good brakes and reliable steering, that the driver is not under the influence of alcohol or drugs and is not sleep deprived, is a qualified driver, has good hearing and good eyesight. These are actually the things that I really need in that moment of uncertainty, so that I know that the driver and the car are going to be able to deal with whatever comes their way. And that's the way that I look at how we prepare young people. And that how relates to intelligence. How do we help people develop the sophisticated forms of intelligence that they are going to need to navigate this foggy road, so to speak? And so we can think about intelligence, and over the years we've described it as the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills, a quickness of mental comprehension, knowledge, wisdom, the ability to speak and write in Latin, Greek and Hebrew, which, by the way, was what you needed to be able to do to get into Harvard when it was first founded. And we can think about it as goal-directed adaptive behavior, which is actually quite an AI-type description. Or we can think of it in the way that Howard Gardner has suggested that we might think about intelligence as being entailing a set of skills around problem solving, around genuine problems and difficulties that we might encounter, finding and creating problems, and laying the groundwork for knowledge acquisition. And so learning from all of these past ways of thinking about artificial intelligence, I believe that we need to think about human intelligence and the way that we prepare young people, and actually older people too, but we're focusing on young people today, for this foggy road journey. And if we unpack human intelligence and think about it as a complex, interwoven set of not separate intelligences, but perhaps not separate intelligences, but perhaps intertwined elements that enable us to be intelligent in different sorts of ways. So there's interdisciplinary academic intelligence, which is very much what a lot of formal education focuses on, but that interdisciplinarity is increasingly important. If we just use COVID as an example and think about the way so many different disciplines have had to work together in order for us to tackle this pandemic, whether you're an engineer or even a chemical engineer, but a mechanical engineer or a civil engineer or a doctor or a medical scientist or a logistics expert, and on and on and on. Everybody has to work together to try and help us deal with this real world problem. So that interdisciplinarity is really important. And then there's what I would call meta-knowing intelligence, which isn't metacognition, for me. This is much more about epistemic cognition. So helping students to understand what knowledge is, where does it come from, what's good evidence, how can they demand good evidence and find good evidence to help them know whether they should believe something to be true or not. And actually, even back as far as the early studies in the 1960s done at universities like Harvard, we found that students' epistemic cognition was not that sophisticated. So it's something that's been an issue for very many years, and we really need to work on it now to a greater extent. We have fake news, we have deep fake AI fakes. We really need to help students understand what they should believe, what they shouldn't believe, and why they should believe something. Social intelligence, again, Cornelia mentioned this, and it's super important. And it's a key part of who we are as learning human beings. So absolutely, that's something we need to do. And then there's a set of other meta-intelligences that are fundamental to being human and actually really hard for artificial intelligence. Because what we don't want to do is to help young people to be second-rate AI systems by helping them to do the things that we know our AI systems can do really well. What we really want to do is help young people to be intelligent in the way that our AI systems aren't intelligent, so that they can be complementary and so that the AI augments the human and makes the human more intelligent. So if we think about metacognitive intelligence, of course, it's all about understanding our own cognition. It involves self-regulation. It involves being able to know whether we do know something, whether we do understand something. And if we don't know something, we don't understand it. It means being able to regulate when our attention is being drawn away from what we're trying to do and knowing how to bring that attention back to the focus. Metasubjective intelligence, more than emotional intelligence, this is about understanding our own developing emotional intelligence and that of the other people with whom we interact. Really important as a complement to social intelligence, for example. Metacontextual intelligence is something I think we've underrated throughout the centuries and virtually impossible for AI. We are incredibly good at adapting to different environments, to interact with different people, to change from learning one subject to another subject, to understand how the world works wherever we are. When we used to be able to travel more, I know I could end up in a place that I'd never, ever been to before, and somehow I would be able to get my way around. I might not speak the language, and it might have some little tensions and challenges, but I would be able to do it because I have a very highly sophisticated metacontextual intelligence, way beyond anything AI can achieve. And then if we get all this right, we get this perceived self-efficacy, accurate perceived self-efficacy, where we have people who are able to set goals, really good at setting goals that are within their capability, but also that are beyond their capability because they understand that they will be able to achieve it. They understand their own motivations. They know what they do know, what they don't know. They know how they learn. They know how to motivate themselves. They understand how to progress towards that goal, who to involve, and how to be self-effective in the world in a way that's also way beyond our AI systems. And I've put there 3 little robots, some of which aren't even fully formed robots, to identify where AI can achieve, the sorts of intelligence that AI can achieve, and some of it certainly not completely. So we need to recognize how different we are. And we particularly need to recognize the importance of those self-reflective meta-intelligences, because they are what set us aside from our AI peers, and they're something we really need to leverage. But the key thing to the how is to recognize that artificial intelligence is intelligent in many sorts of ways, but humans are intelligent in way more ways and very rich ways. Even if we look at the debate between people who believe that artificial general intelligence is possible and those who do not, artificial general intelligence being the capability of AI systems to be intelligent in the way that the human brain is, so that it can do more than be good at playing a game or be good at driving a car, or be good at playing chess, or be good at doing a particular form of surgery. You know, we have human surgeons who can play chess, drive a car, also play other games, and many, many other things. But what we really need to recognize is that there's lots about human intelligence that is not accessible to AI. Now, I don't believe it ever will be, but many people disagree, but it's absolutely not accessible now, nor in the next decade. And so how do we build on these connections? Cornelia talked a lot about connections, and I think we need to think about the connections that need to be supported in the education ecosystem within higher education. We need to build partnerships and co-design the way that we can use AI, because one of the implications of AI, beyond what I've talked about, which is about how people need to learn differently and how we need to change our education system to develop these complex intelligences, we also need to think about, which is action 3 in that diagram on the screen, we also need to help people understand about AI and think about how we use AI, such as the SimSensei system within higher education. And we need to recognize that those 3 sorts of ways that AI is implicating on higher education institutions are not discrete. They are an interacting whole. And so one of the ways in which I think we really need to prepare within higher education for the way that we have this VUCA future, and part of it being driven by artificial intelligence, is yes, we need to focus on those complex intelligences that are uniquely human. But as institutions, we also need to address, I'm going to just flick back a slide, the second action there, educating people about AI. And actually part of that is preparing the institution as a whole to be AI ready, so that when you decide to buy in a system like SimSensei or some other form of AI, you make the right decision. So not only are you looking at how you educate young people to be better equipped to deal with this uncertain future, you're also looking at how you help people within the institution to understand how to help that institution be better at dealing with that uncertain future. And so we have this 7-step AI readiness framework, which uses the acronym ETHICAL, which represents the letters of the start of the 7 steps, which is all about helping organizations to become better prepared to see themselves through a data and an AI lens, so that they can leverage their data, help people understand why that data is important to modern machine learning AI, and become a really AI-ready institution. And that is about enthusing the entire population, looking at exactly what challenge you want to focus on as you use AI, looking at the data that you've got and that you can collect that will help you understand that challenge more, and then using AI techniques to understand that data before you decide how to use AI to help you address the particular challenge you've identified. And that means you will address that challenge way more effectively with AI than you would if you didn't prepare yourselves in this way. I think as my final point, I will just say that we often focus on artificial intelligence as being a problem-solving technique, but actually, in the early days of artificial intelligence, it was as much about understanding problems as it was about building the solution. And that's what the AI Readiness Programme is there to do. So thank you so much for listening to me. I hope you found that useful, and I'm here and happy to answer any questions as appropriate.
Thank you so much indeed, Rose, and also Cornelia. Wow, what an opening of information, not only work, but intelligence. I'm sure we all found that fascinating, both your presentations. It's now time to go to our workshops, which will be starting in 3 minutes at 11:30 or 10:30 if you're watching us on GMT, and they will go on to 12:15. If you have signed up for a workshop, you can absolutely attend a different one. You just need to either go back to the auditorium and click the room of your choice, or use the direct link that appeared in the chat, I think at the end of Rose's presentation. So the workshops last 45 minutes. Please feel free to navigate between them if you wish, and we'll all be coming back at 12:15 to have a wrap up of the different workshops. So enjoy, learn, and see you then.